distant alarm echoes through the darkness. Welcome, friends. Draw a little closer and let the noise of the ordinary world fade behind you. Beyond the bright lanes of civilization, forgotten vows, buried hatred, and ancient shadows still drift among the stars, waiting for the moment they are remembered. Some legends end with a single battle, while others simply disappear until the galaxy believes them gone. Come with me now and listen carefully, for this is one of those stories. The galaxy believed Darth Maul was dead. His body had been hurled into the endless depths of the reactor shaft beneath the royal palace on Naboo. His double-bladed lightsaber split from his grasp, his plans shattered beside the ambitions of his master. The story spread from Republic worlds to forgotten Outer Rim ports until it hardened into accepted truth, repeated by smugglers over cheap liquor and by senators beneath polished domes alike. To most beings, the Sith assassin had become another ghost, swallowed by history. Yet the dark side was patient, and hatred possessed a strength that even death struggled to extinguish. Far beyond the crowded hyperspace lanes, hidden among fields of broken asteroids where no lawful chart marked a safe passage, an abandoned mining station drifted in silence. Its corridors were cold enough to sting exposed skin, and stale air carried the scent of rust, scorched wiring, and old machinery left to decay. Emergency lights blinked weakly through clouds of drifting dust, casting crimson shadows that seemed to breathe with every flicker. Somewhere within that hollow metal grave, something lived. It did not sleep peacefully, nor did it dream of mercy. Maul dragged himself through the narrow passage on crude mechanical legs assembled from scavenged machinery and twisted scraps of mining equipment. Every movement scraped metal against metal, filling the corridor with harsh echoes that seemed almost alive. Pain traveled through what remained of his body like molten iron, yet it barely registered beside the furnace of his anger. His crimson and black face had grown gaunt, his yellow eyes burned with relentless intensity, and his broken horns cast jagged shadows across the walls whenever the lights flickered overhead. He spoke to no one because no one remained to hear him, but hatred answered every silent thought. The memory returned again without invitation. A blue blade flashed through the air. Obi-Wan Kenobi, younger than the Jedi Masters yet carrying unexpected resolve, had vaulted from the abyss with impossible speed. Maul remembered the brief surprise that pierced his perfect confidence, the burning agony as the lightsaber severed him at the waist, and the endless fall into darkness beneath the palace. His fingers curled until the metal beneath them bent with a shriek. Kenobi, he whispered through clenched teeth, and the name lingered in the stale air like a curse carved into stone. Time had become meaningless within the station. Days blended into weeks, and weeks dissolved into months, measured only by failing generators and dwindling supplies scavenged from forgotten storage rooms. Small creatures nested in broken ventilation shafts, watching the horned figure with frightened curiosity before scurrying away whenever his temper erupted. Sometimes Maul hunted them with startling speed despite his injuries, not because hunger demanded it, but because violence briefly quieted the storm inside him. Each kill reminded him that he still possessed purpose, even if the galaxy had erased his name. The dark side answered whenever despair threatened to creep into the corners of his thoughts. Rage sharpened his senses, until he could hear coolant dripping through pipes 3 corridors away and feel faint vibrations traveling across the station's fractured hull. Broken machines yielded to his will, pulled across rooms by invisible force until they crashed into walls with explosive violence. He rebuilt his crude lower body countless times, replacing bent supports and fractured joints with stronger pieces scavenged from industrial loaders. Survival became an act of defiance. Every breath declared that Obi-Wan Kenobi had failed to finish what he had begun. One evening, if the endless darkness outside could still be called evening, an automated distress receiver buried deep within the station suddenly crackled to life. The sound echoed through empty corridors before settling into a stream of fragmented HoloNet transmissions intercepted by outdated equipment. Merchants complained of pirate raids. Republic officials discussed trade disputes in distant sectors. Bounty hunters advertised their latest captures for anyone willing to pay. Maul ignored the meaningless chatter until one conversation froze him, where he crouched. 2 rough voices laughed over a private channel that had accidentally bled into the receiver's frequency. They spoke of a wealthy crime lord from the Outer Rim who intended to host an extravagant banquet aboard his luxurious orbital yacht. Guests from several powerful criminal syndicates had already accepted invitations, eager to celebrate profitable alliances and old victories over fallen enemies. One voice chuckled before saying, "The centerpiece is supposed to be some Sith relic bought from Black Sun collectors. Funny thing is, the host says it belonged to Darth Maul himself. Imagine paying a fortune for scraps from a dead monster." Their laughter echoed through the receiver until Maul struck the ancient console with enough force to shatter its casing. Silence returned, but the words refused to leave him. A relic, his relic, stolen from battlefields and traded between scavengers who had no understanding of what they possessed. His breathing slowed, becoming dangerously controlled as images formed inside his mind with perfect clarity. Wealthy criminals feasting beneath glittering chandeliers while displaying a piece of Sith history as decoration. They toasted his death with expensive wine while his name entertained them like an amusing legend. Maul closed his eyes and reached into the dark side with all the strength still burning within him. Hatred answered immediately, wrapping around his wounded spirit like living fire. The banquet was more than an insult. It was an opportunity delivered by fate itself, a gathering of ambitious criminals who believed fear had abandoned the galaxy. They would dine expecting comfort, surrounded by guards, wealth, and false confidence. Before the night ended, every elegant hall aboard that yacht would become a hunting ground. He limped toward a storage chamber where scavenged equipment lay stacked in uneven piles beneath torn tarps. Old robes, breathing masks, maintenance uniforms, tools stolen from abandoned cargo ships, and fragments of forgotten technology covered every surface. None of it resembled the fearsome armor he had once worn at the command of Darth Sidious. Yet appearances no longer mattered. Survival had stripped away pride and left only purpose behind. If deception granted him access to his enemies, then deception would serve the Sith as faithfully as any lightsaber. Outside the station, distant stars glittered beyond fractured viewports like cold eyes watching from eternity. Somewhere among them drifted the luxurious vessel where laughter already filled polished dining halls and servants prepared tables for honored guests. They believed the evening would celebrate victory, wealth, and the passing of an old terror into legend. None of them knew that the legend still breathed, nor that every agonizing step Maul took toward his stolen shuttle carried him closer to their table. Revenge had begun long before the first guest would raise a glass, and the meal awaiting them would not be the one they expected. The stolen shuttle had once belonged to a mining contractor, and every system aboard bore the scars of years spent hauling ore through dangerous sectors. Warning indicators glowed across the cockpit in faded amber, while loose panels rattled whenever the engines strained against their age. Maul guided the vessel through empty space with steady hands, ignoring the complaints of failing machinery as though they were insects buzzing beyond his concern. He had piloted sleek Sith craft designed for war, but necessity had become a more loyal companion than comfort. Every vibration beneath his boots reminded him that survival belonged not to the strongest alone, but to those willing to endure humiliation until the moment arrived to strike. He studied the fragmented navigational data he had extracted from the intercepted transmission. The banquet would take place aboard the Gilded Crown, an immense luxury yacht owned by the Hutt-affiliated crime lord Vargos Deln, a human whose fortune had grown by transporting contraband through forgotten hyperspace routes beyond Republic patrols. Deln preferred to surround himself with beauty instead of soldiers, believing lavish surroundings projected greater strength than rows of battle droids ever could. Nevertheless, the guest list revealed experienced killers from Black Sun Vigo envoys traveling under false identities, mercenary captains, information brokers, spice dealers, and ambitious syndicate representatives eager to divide new territories. It was precisely the sort of gathering Darth Sidious had once taught him to observe carefully before destroying. As stars stretched into luminous rivers and hyperspace swallowed the shuttle, Maul sat motionless within the dim cockpit. The rhythmic hum of the hyperdrive became almost hypnotic, but his thoughts refused any peace. He remembered another journey years earlier, when Sidious had stood beside him inside a far more elegant vessel, speaking with quiet certainty. "A true weapon does not merely kill," his master had said while watching blue hyperspace currents race beyond the viewport. "It shapes the battlefield before the first blow falls." Maul had embraced those words without hesitation then, and now, despite betrayal, abandonment, and unbearable suffering, he found they remained carved into his mind as deeply as any scar. He no longer knew whether Sidious believed him dead or simply irrelevant. The question stirred like poison beneath the surface of his anger, but he forced it away before it could distract him. Revenge demanded precision, not wounded pride. Kenobi remained alive. Sidious remained hidden. Those debts would one day be collected, yet neither could be reached through reckless action. The banquet offered something different, a chance to reclaim fear itself, to remind the underworld that forgotten predators often returned hungrier than before. Hours later, the shuttle emerged from hyperspace near the outer edge of the Karen Belt, where jagged moons circled a pale gas giant wrapped in silver storms. Traffic filled the region despite its isolation. Freighters lumbered between orbital stations, private yachts gleamed beneath reflected starlight, and heavily armed escort corvettes patrolled invisible security routes around the gathering of criminal elites. Hanging above everything drifted the gilded crown, its enormous hull polished to such perfection that distant suns shimmered across its curved surface like flowing gold. Long observation windows lined its upper decks, revealing warm light, elegant architecture, and movement within. It resembled a floating palace rather than a vessel built to cross hostile space. Maul reduced power and allowed his battered shuttle to drift among incoming service craft carrying food, decorations, musicians, and maintenance crews hired for the evening. Hundreds of workers passed through temporary security checkpoints established to accommodate the unusually large celebration. Cargo inspectors focused on manifests instead of faces, overwhelmed by endless deliveries arriving against strict schedules. Wealth bred carelessness. The organizers worried more about expensive wine arriving on time than about an unnoticed servant blending into the crowd. He landed inside one of the auxiliary docking bays, where loaders hurried between stacked containers filled with exotic fruit from Felucia, rare seafood transported alive in shimmering tanks, polished furniture, and crates of vintage liquor imported from distant worlds. Steam drifted from kitchen vents carrying aromas rich with roasted meats, fragrant herbs, sweet pastries, and unfamiliar spices. Voices overlapped in dozens of accents, while supervisors barked impatient orders into comlinks. Amid the confusion, no one spared more than a passing glance toward another maintenance worker wearing stained robes beneath a plain utility cloak. The breathing mask concealed the lower half of Maul's face, while gloves hid the unmistakable markings upon his hands. A harried quartermaster shoved a data slate against his chest without looking up from another shipment. "Storage Corridor 12, the man muttered. "Kitchen staff are already behind schedule, so stop standing there and move those service crates before the chef starts screaming again." Maul accepted the slate without speaking, giving only a slight nod before lifting a heavy container with effortless strength disguised beneath measured movements. The quartermaster had already turned away, shouting at another worker over a shipment of imported crystal glassware. The deception had begun more easily than expected. The interior of the yacht contrasted violently with the abandoned station Maul had left behind. Floors of polished stone reflected golden light from elaborate chandeliers suspended above vaulted ceilings. Decorative fountains flowed through open galleries, filling the air with cool moisture and the gentle sound of cascading water. Living trees from Naboo and Alderaan flourished inside carefully maintained gardens, enclosed beneath transparent domes, their leaves swaying softly beneath artificial breezes. Wealth had transformed a starship into a monument of excess, and every elegant detail stirred fresh contempt within him. As he carried crates through service corridors, Maul listened rather than watched. Servants gossiped freely, convinced invisible laborers had no importance beyond their assigned tasks. He learned that Vergos Deln insisted every guest pass through the Hall of Triumph before entering the dining chamber. There, valuable artifacts acquired from defeated rivals stood inside illuminated display cases. One servant whispered that the centerpiece rested beneath a crimson cloth until the host revealed it during the opening toast. Another laughed nervously and claimed the object looked cursed even through its protective casing. Neither understood why merely hearing those words caused the silent worker beside them to tighten his grip until the crate creaked beneath his fingers. He reached an intersection where transparent walls overlooked the Hall of Triumph below. Workers hurried across balconies above a magnificent chamber lined with statues, ancient weapons, jeweled crowns, and relics stolen from every corner of the galaxy. Musicians rehearsed quietly at one end, while attendants polished display cases until they gleamed beneath focused lights. At the center of the hall stood a raised platform concealed beneath heavy crimson fabric, guarded by 4 armored mercenaries carrying military-grade blaster carbines. Even from that distance, Maul felt a familiar pull radiating through the Force. Whatever lay beneath the cloth had indeed belonged to the Sith. He remained perfectly still for only a heartbeat before continuing along the corridor, with the same measured pace expected of any anonymous servant. Inside, however, the furnace of his hatred burned hotter than it had since Naboo. His relic had not simply been stolen. It had been elevated into a trophy meant to entertain criminals fattened by greed and arrogance. They would soon gather around it with cups raised high, congratulating one another beneath warm lights and pleasant music. None of them suspected that the quiet servant disappearing into the kitchens had already begun counting the moments until dinner was served. The kitchens of the Gilded Crown were a world unto themselves, hidden behind polished doors that concealed the frantic machinery required to sustain the illusion of effortless luxury. Steam rolled upward from enormous cooking vats, carrying the scent of roasted nuna, fresh sea herbs from Moncala, and sweet glazes prepared from fruits imported across half the galaxy. Cooks shouted measurements over the clatter of knives and cookware, while service droids glided between crowded workstations with mechanical precision. Every surface gleamed despite the chaos, for Vargos Deln tolerated neither delay nor imperfection. Amid hundreds of workers moving with practiced urgency, one silent servant attracted no notice at all. Maul carried trays, shifted cargo, and accepted curt instructions with lowered eyes. His disguise depended less upon clothing than upon expectation. Wealthy beings rarely looked closely at those who served them, and those who labored beside him had neither time nor interest to question another exhausted worker. He memorized every corridor, every security checkpoint, and every emergency access door he passed. His thoughts assembled the yacht into a living map where every kitchen passage connected to grand halls above and hidden maintenance shafts below. An elderly Duros chef stormed across the central kitchen with flour dusting his blue sleeves like pale ash. If those desserts arrive warm, he barked toward a line of frightened assistants, I'll have every one of you scrubbing grease traps until the next core festival. Several workers rushed to obey, while another accidentally dropped a serving platter that shattered across the polished floor. The chef groaned, rubbing both temples before glaring toward Maul. You there. Take this wine to the Hall of Triumph, and don't spill a drop unless you enjoy explaining yourself to Lord Deln. Maul accepted the crystal case with a respectful nod, his silence mistaken for obedience rather than calculation. The route to the hall passed through narrow service corridors, hidden behind decorative walls. Small observation windows allowed servants to monitor the progress of ceremonies without entering the public chambers. Through one opening, Maul watched musicians tuning elegant stringed instruments beneath towering columns carved from pale stone. Floral arrangements from Naboo filled the air with delicate perfume that barely masked the richer aromas drifting from the kitchens. Guests had not yet entered, but attendants made endless adjustments to chairs, banners, and silver table settings, polished until they reflected the chandeliers overhead. As he approached the Hall of Triumph, Maul slowed almost imperceptibly. The 4 mercenaries guarding the central display remained alert, though their discipline carried the relaxed confidence of professionals expecting boredom rather than danger. One adjusted his shoulder armor while another joked quietly about the expensive wines reserved for honored guests. Their rifles rested comfortably within reach, but none kept a finger near the trigger. They believed the greatest threat aboard the yacht would be an intoxicated smuggler insulting a rival during dessert. The crimson cloth still concealed the centerpiece, though the Force whispered from beneath it with growing insistence. Maul felt the familiar presence like heat radiating from buried embers. It was not alive, nor did it call to him in words, yet it carried echoes of violence, ambition, and disciplined cruelty. His master had once insisted that objects steeped in the dark side retained memories invisible to ordinary beings. Standing only meters away, Maul understood exactly what Sidious had meant. The relic remembered him, even if the galaxy had forgotten. A pair of elegantly dressed protocol attendants entered the chamber, carrying final seating assignments for the evening's honored guests. One consulted a glowing data pad before sighing in satisfaction. Black Sun representatives will sit closest to Lord Dellon, she explained. The Pike envoys requested the eastern side of the table, while the bounty captains insisted upon clear access to the observation balcony. Her companion smiled knowingly. Nobody trusts anyone. That's why tonight will be entertaining. They laughed softly as they continued arranging ornate place markers crafted from polished crystal. Maul resumed walking before anyone noticed his pause. He delivered the wine without incident, accepted another assignment, and disappeared once more into the unseen arteries of the vessel. Every passing conversation became another piece of intelligence. Several security officers discussed rotating patrols after the opening ceremony. 2 technicians complained that the surveillance network contained temporary blind spots because decorative lighting had overloaded auxiliary power systems. Elsewhere, servants whispered that Lord Dellon intended to unveil his greatest acquisition with a speech celebrating the downfall of those who relied upon fear instead of wealth. Maul almost smiled beneath the breathing mask. Hours passed as the yacht transformed from busy preparation into flawless spectacle. The first guests began arriving through grand docking ports reserved for private craft bearing family crests, syndicate insignias, and encrypted transponder codes. Men and women draped in expensive fabrics crossed crimson carpets, while servants relieved them of cloaks and ceremonial weapons. Jewelry caught the light like scattered stars, and laughter echoed beneath vaulted ceilings already filled with music. Behind every polished greeting lingered cautious eyes measuring rivals, calculating alliances, and searching for weakness beneath practiced smiles. From a concealed service balcony overlooking the main reception chamber, Maul observed the gathering in silence. Black Sun delegates conversed with polished confidence, though their bodyguards watched every doorway. Representatives of the Pike Syndicate arrived cloaked in embroidered robes, their masked faces revealing nothing, while attendants carried sealed cases that likely contained gifts or bribes. Independent pirate captains boasted loudly over glasses of imported liquor, eager to appear more powerful than they truly were. Every faction projected strength. Every faction distrusted the others. The feast already rested upon a foundation of concealed suspicion, requiring only the smallest push to collapse into bloodshed. Then the host himself entered. Vargos Deln walked into the reception hall with the easy confidence of a man convinced the galaxy rewarded his every decision. He was broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in dark formal robes, threaded with subtle gold embroidery that reflected the surrounding lights without appearing gaudy. His neatly trimmed beard framed a smile practiced before mirrors and negotiations alike, warm enough to welcome allies yet cold enough to remind them who controlled the room. Rings bearing gemstones from half a dozen systems glittered across his fingers as he greeted each guest by name. He radiated satisfaction, not because he had survived danger, but because he believed danger had become something he could purchase, display, and laugh about. Maul watched him for several long moments without moving. This was no reckless pirate or drunken warlord. Deln possessed patience, intelligence, and enough discipline to build influence among beings who trusted no one. That made him more dangerous than his lavish surroundings suggested. Yet Maul also recognized the fatal flaw hidden beneath the polished manners. The crime lord had begun believing that wealth alone granted control over fate. Tonight he would discover that there were powers in the galaxy no fortune could buy, no guards could stop, and no banquet could survive. The final hour before the banquet settled over the gilded crown with deceptive calm. Musicians filled the grand reception hall with graceful melodies, while servants flowed between the guests, carrying silver trays laden with jeweled goblets and delicate appetizers prepared with obsessive precision. Laughter drifted beneath crystal chandeliers, rising and falling like gentle waves that concealed sharp rocks beneath the surface. Every smile carried calculation, every toast masked negotiation, and every polite embrace disguised years of rivalry. Maul moved unseen through the edges of the celebration, watching predators pretend to be friends. He carried another tray into the reception chamber, keeping his head lowered beneath the hood of his servant's cloak. His breathing remained slow despite the storm inside him. The force brushed against every living mind nearby, allowing him to sense flickers of greed, suspicion, pride, and ambition flowing through the gathering like invisible currents. No Jedi serenity softened those emotions. These were criminals, and their thoughts possessed a familiar darkness that made them easy to read. Each one believed they would leave the yacht richer than when they had arrived. Vargos Deln stood at the center of a circle of honored guests, accepting congratulations with polished confidence. A broad-shouldered Nikto pirate captain raised his glass and laughed. "You've outdone yourself, Deln. Half the underworld answered your invitation. Even the Black Sun Vigos sent representatives instead of hired killers." Deln smiled modestly, though satisfaction gleamed in his eyes. "Influence is built by offering opportunity, not fear," he replied. "The age of mysterious assassins and cloaked fanatics has passed. Commerce lasts longer than terror. Several guests nodded in agreement, and more than one chuckled knowingly. Maul paused only long enough to hear the words before continuing toward another cluster of guests. His fingers tightened around the tray until the polished metal bent almost imperceptibly beneath his grip. Sidious had once taught him that arrogance often announced itself before defeat, and Deln now displayed that lesson without realizing it. The crime lord had built his empire by studying the ambitions of others, yet he had overlooked the oldest danger of all. He believed a dead enemy could never return. A pair of Black Sun envoys drifted away from the crowd and settled near one of the towering observation windows overlooking the stars. Their voices remained low, but Maul required no effort to overhear them. "Once Deln announces the territorial agreements," one murmured, "our employers expect immediate signatures. The Pikes will gain new spice corridors, while we secure the shipping routes along the expansion region." His companion glanced toward the hall with practiced caution. "And Deln?" The first envoy smiled faintly. "If he becomes inconvenient later, accidents are common in our profession." Elsewhere, another conversation unfolded between two bounty hunters whose expensive armor had been polished for the occasion. One swirled dark wine inside a crystal glass before grinning. "You hear what he's displaying tonight?" he asked. "Some Sith relic pulled out of a Black Sun vault." The other shrugged dismissively. "Just another collector's prize. Dead warriors always become expensive decorations." They laughed together before reaching for another tray carried by an unsuspecting servant. Maul offered them drinks with perfect composure, never allowing even the slightest flicker of recognition to reach his face. The great doors leading into the Hall of Triumph slowly opened, and the musicians lowered their instruments into respectful silence. Gold light spilled into the reception chamber as attendants invited the assembled guests toward the ceremonial display. Rich fabrics rustled across polished floors, while jeweled necklaces shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Hundreds of footsteps echoed through the magnificent chamber until every guest faced the raised platform concealed beneath its crimson covering. Guards sealed the entrance behind them with quiet efficiency. Vargos Deln climbed the central dais with practiced grace and spread his hands toward the gathered audience. "Friends," he announced warmly, his voice carried effortlessly through hidden speakers woven into the architecture. "We meet tonight not merely to celebrate prosperity, but to honor certainty. The galaxy belongs to those who build, negotiate, and endure. We have outlived tyrants, warlords, corrupt officials, and fanatics who believed fear alone could shape destiny." Applause rippled through the chamber. Deln allowed it to fade before continuing. "One such fanatic serves as the inspiration for tonight's centerpiece." With theatrical precision, he grasped the edge of the crimson cloth. The fabric swept away in one smooth motion. Beneath it rested a transparent display case supported by black stone carved with unfamiliar symbols collected from forgotten ruins. Inside lay half of a double-bladed lightsaber hilt, its polished metal scarred by battle yet unmistakably crafted for a Sith warrior. Beside it rested a fragment of scorched black cloak and a broken section of durasteel from Naboo's reactor complex, mounted as though they were priceless works of art. The chamber filled with approving murmurs, while hidden spotlights bathed the relics in crimson light. Deln circled the display with the pride of a curator, unveiling his finest masterpiece. Recovered through considerable expense, he declared, these remains belonged to Darth Maul, the assassin who terrorized worlds before meeting his end at the hands of a Jedi. Once he inspired whispers across the galaxy, now he serves as proof that even the most feared monsters become trophies when history moves on. Laughter rolled through the audience. Several guests raised their glasses toward the display case in mocking salute. From the rear of the chamber, Maul stood among a line of silent servants. The Force pulsed violently around him. Every instinct demanded immediate violence. Every memory of Naboo sharpened into unbearable clarity. He saw Qui-Gon Jinn falling beneath his blade. He saw Obi-Wan's furious leap. He saw the endless shaft swallowing him into darkness while his broken weapon vanished above. The relic before him was not merely metal. It was the final fragment of the life stolen from him, reduced to entertainment for thieves who understood nothing of its meaning. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. That surprised even him. The rage remained, but it settled into something colder, more dangerous than blind fury. Sidious had trained him to kill with precision rather than impulse, and those lessons survived every wound inflicted upon his body. If he struck now, the guards would contain the panic before it spread. Too many guests would escape. Too many leaders would survive to rebuild their alliances elsewhere. No, they had gathered willingly inside a palace floating alone in the darkness of space. By the end of the evening, none of them would remember the banquet for its speeches, its music, or its extravagant meal. They would remember only the moment they learned that Darth Maul had accepted the invitation. The applause lingered long after Vargos Deln stepped away from the display, echoing through the Hall of Triumph beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with crystal and gold. Servants resumed circulating among the guests, replenishing drinks as conversation swelled into confident laughter once more. The unveiling had achieved exactly what Deln intended. Rival syndicates admired his wealth, envied his influence, and accepted his claim that the age of legendary warriors had given way to the age of prosperous crime lords. Maul moved silently through the crowd, carrying a silver tray, listening as pride made careful people careless. A Devaronian financier stopped before the display case and leaned close enough to study the damaged lightsaber hilt through the transparent shielding. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he remarked, swirling amber liquor inside his glass. Imagine the price collectors would pay if the other half were ever found. Beside him, a Black Sun representative smiled faintly. "Collectors?" he replied. "I'd melt it down. Fear has no resale value once its owner is dead." Several listeners laughed, and another guest tapped the glass protecting the relic with a jeweled ring before wandering away. Maul felt the sound strike him like a blade across old scars, yet his face remained hidden beneath the hood. The guests gradually filtered toward the grand dining chamber, where a table of astonishing length stretched beneath suspended chandeliers resembling clusters of frozen stars. Hundreds of candles burned without smoke, their warm glow reflected by polished marble floors and towering windows that revealed the endless darkness beyond the yacht. Fine porcelain rested beside engraved silver cutlery arranged with mathematical precision. Crystal goblets shimmered beneath the light, and every place setting bore a name engraved upon polished plaques. The room had been designed to impress beings accustomed to luxury, yet even such magnificence could not erase the quiet tension lingering beneath polite conversation. Maul entered through a servant's passage, overlooking the dining hall from above. Hidden balconies and narrow maintenance walkways crisscross the ceiling behind decorative latticework, invisible to the guests below. From this vantage point, he observed not only the seating arrangements but also the security measures protecting the celebration. 8 armed guards occupied discreet positions around the perimeter, while additional personnel monitored entrances concealed behind ornamental walls. More importantly, he noted the locations of emergency blast doors capable of sealing entire sections of the yacht within seconds. Deln had prepared for assassination. He simply expected it to come from rivals seated at his table. The first course arrived with remarkable coordination. Dozens of servants emerged carrying silver platters fragrant with roasted Nuna glazed in sweet citrus reduction harvested from distant colonies. Aromas of fresh herbs, rich sauces, and warm bread drifted through the chamber, momentarily replacing the sterile scent of polished stone. Guests complimented the cuisine while negotiations resumed between careful bites. Contracts disguised as dinner conversation unfolded from one end of the table to the other. Each smile measured, each promise weighed against hidden ambitions. Maul descended another service staircase into the kitchens beneath the dining hall. Here, the frantic pace had intensified as cooks raced to prepare successive courses without interrupting the illusion of effortless abundance above. No one questioned the quiet servant who moved confidently through crowded workstations carrying sealed containers toward the storage rooms. In truth, his destination lay beyond them. He slipped through an unmarked maintenance hatch, leading into the vessel's lower utility network, where humming generators and coolant conduits replaced polished luxury with exposed machinery. The darkness welcomed him. He advanced through narrow access tunnels until he reached the primary environmental control junction serving the banquet deck. Thick cables disappeared into reinforced walls, while coolant pipes vibrated steadily beneath the immense demand placed upon the yacht's lighting and climate systems. Kneeling beside a maintenance console, Maul extended one hand toward its exposed circuitry. The force flowed through him with terrible focus. Tiny components shuddered before reconnecting in subtly altered patterns invisible to ordinary technicians. He was not destroying the systems. He was teaching them precisely how to fail. A quiet alarm flickered briefly before vanishing again. Within moments, the environmental controls began rerouting power through unnecessary backup circuits, gradually overloading sections of the security grid while leaving essential life support functions untouched. Surveillance cameras covering service corridors blinked intermittently as auxiliary processors struggled to compensate. Hidden locks protecting internal blast doors shifted into manual override without announcing the change. The yacht continued operating normally from every visible perspective, yet beneath its polished exterior, the first threads of order had already begun unraveling. Maul allowed himself the smallest trace of satisfaction. He returned to the kitchens carrying an empty supply case, blending effortlessly into the endless rhythm of overworked servants rushing between ovens and storage rooms. A young human server nearly collided with him while balancing an elaborate dessert arrangement. "Sorry," she gasped, catching the tray before it tipped. "Everything's happening too fast tonight." Maul steadied the platter with one gloved hand before releasing it. She offered a grateful smile and hurried away, never realizing that the silent worker who had spared her evening intended to plunge the entire vessel into terror before midnight. Above, the banquet reached its most relaxed moment. Wine flowed more freely. Negotiation softened into stories of successful smuggling runs, profitable betrayals, and narrow escapes from Republic patrols. Laughter rolled across the chamber with increasing confidence as expensive food dulled suspicion. Vargos Deln raised another toast celebrating future partnerships, and the assembled guests answered enthusiastically. They believed the evening had reached its safest point, where formalities faded and genuine business could begin. Only one man in the room understood that the true banquet had not yet started. Standing unnoticed beside the western wall, Maul studied every face surrounding the enormous table. He identified the loudest voices, the quickest tempers, the rivals seated just close enough to provoke one another should confusion arise. His gaze settled briefly upon Deln, whose broad smile reflected complete satisfaction with the success of his gathering. Then his attention shifted toward the chandeliers suspended high above, the concealed security stations hidden beyond decorative panels, and finally the sealed display case still containing the broken half of his lightsaber hilt. He had not come merely to kill. Any assassin could have slipped poison into a goblet or hidden a blaster beneath servants' robes. That would have ended lives but accomplished little else. Maul sought something greater. He intended to strip away certainty itself, to transform the safest room aboard the grandest vessel into a place where trust dissolved, allies turned upon one another, and every survivor carried nightmares back to the farthest corners of the underworld. Before this night ended, Vargos Deln's magnificent banquet would become the story by which future crime lords measured fear, and every whisper would end with the same impossible words. Darth Maul had come back from the dead. Io. The second course arrived with flawless precision, and the illusion of perfect order remained intact. Servants glided between the guests carrying carved cuts of roasted game from the forests of Onderon, delicate seafood flown from Mon Cala, and fragrant vegetables harvested from private estates that few beings in the galaxy could afford to visit. Crystal glasses caught the warm light as wine flowed without interruption, and musicians, hidden behind carved balconies, filled the chamber with restrained melodies that never overpowered conversation. Every detail had been rehearsed until it appeared effortless. Beneath that polished surface, however, unseen systems were beginning to fail, exactly as Maul had intended. One of the security officers frowned as his comlink emitted a brief burst of static. He tapped the device twice before speaking quietly into its receiver. "Control, confirm surveillance on the Western service corridors." A pause followed, broken only by faint interference. Finally, a distorted reply answered, "Camera feed is unstable. Engineering is rerouting auxiliary power, no threat detected. The officer accepted the explanation with mild annoyance rather than concern. Technical faults happened aboard starships every day, and wealthy hosts preferred celebrations to continue without interruption over investigating minor inconveniences. At the far end of the table, negotiations had become increasingly direct. A Pike representative leaned toward a Black Sun envoy, lowering his voice despite the surrounding music. Our employers require exclusive transport rights through the Kessel Corridor. Deln understands that already. The envoy smiled without warmth and folded his hands upon the polished table. Understanding and agreement are not the same thing. We intend to leave tonight with signatures, not promises. Their expressions remained courteous, but beneath the table both bodyguards shifted their weight ever so slightly, sensing the growing tension without hearing every word. Vargos Deln observed those exchanges with quiet satisfaction. He enjoyed watching rivals circle one another because every disagreement increased his own value as mediator. Wealth had taught him that influence rarely required brute force. One needed only to become indispensable. As another servant refilled his glass, Deln remarked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "Gentle beings, let us not waste such excellent food arguing over tomorrow's profits. Tonight we celebrate success. Tomorrow we divide the galaxy." More laughter followed, though several smiles appeared thinner than before. Maul stood near the rear of the chamber with a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. His yellow eyes moved constantly beneath the shadow of his hood, measuring distance, timing, and opportunity. The force flowed through the room like invisible wind, carrying whispers of impatience, greed, and concealed hostility. Every proud heartbeat fed the darkness surrounding him. He no longer felt like an intruder within the banquet. He felt like the inevitable end waiting patiently at its edge. A kitchen supervisor hurried toward the serving staff, with obvious frustration written across his face. "The lifts are malfunctioning again," he snapped. "Half the dessert supplies are trapped on the lower storage deck, and engineering claims they'll need 20 minutes to restore normal power routing." One of the cooks threw up both hands. 20 minutes? Lord Deln specifically ordered the third course without delay. The supervisor rubbed his forehead before pointing toward several workers. "Use the maintenance elevators. I don't care how you get there, just move." Maul accepted another sealed container without protest and joined the group heading toward the auxiliary service lifts. The cramped elevator descended deep into the yacht's lower decks, where luxury disappeared behind exposed conduits and humming machinery. Workers complained about impossible schedules while wiping sweat from their brows, too exhausted to notice that one silent servant never joined their conversations. When the doors opened, the others hurried toward refrigerated storage rooms, leaving Maul alone beside the maintenance junction he had already sabotaged earlier that evening. He stepped into the narrow control chamber and closed the access hatch behind him. Rows of power regulators blinked steadily across the wall, their diagnostic indicators showing only minor fluctuations invisible to untrained eyes. Maul placed both hands upon the central conduit housing and closed his eyes. Hatred rose within him with practiced ease, not wild or uncontrolled, but sharpened into a precise instrument. Through the force, He felt electricity coursing through every deck of the vessel, racing along cables hidden beneath polished floors and decorative walls. Slowly, almost delicately, he tightened his invisible grip. The generators answered. A deep vibration rolled through the hull. Lights flickered once throughout the banquet deck before stabilizing again. Guests paused only briefly, exchanging puzzled glances before resuming their conversations. Deln smiled reassuringly and raised his glass. Nothing to worry about. The gilded crown is older than she looks. A ripple of polite laughter eased the moment, and musicians resumed playing without missing another note. Yet several guards instinctively rested their hands nearer their weapons, while engineers throughout the yacht began searching for the source of a disturbance that refused to leave any obvious trace. Maul released the conduit and opened his eyes. That had been only a warning. He left the control chamber as quietly as he had entered, passing maintenance crews rushing toward diagnostic stations farther down the corridor. They hurried past him carrying toolkits and portable scanners, never suspecting the cause of the mysterious failures, had just stepped calmly into the service elevator beside them. Above, the banquet continued beneath warm light and refined music, but the rhythm had changed. Guests glanced more frequently toward the doors. Conversations paused whenever another faint vibration traveled through the floor beneath their feet. As Maul emerged once more behind the dining hall, he noticed something that pleased him even more than the technical failures. Trust had begun to crack. A pirate captain whispered to his lieutenant while eyeing the Black Sun delegation. The Pikes quietly repositioned 2 additional bodyguards closer to their seats. One information broker subtly activated a concealed holdout blaster beneath the table, believing no one had seen the movement. Fear did not arrive as a roar. It arrived as tiny decisions repeated across a room until confidence quietly disappeared. Standing motionless in the shadows, beyond the servants' entrance, Maul watched the banquet unravel one invisible thread at a time. No blood had been spilled. No weapon had yet been drawn. Still, the feast no longer belonged to Vargos Deln. It belonged to the Sith, who had entered unnoticed hours earlier, and every passing minute tightened his grip around the evening, like a slow closing fist. The first scream had not yet echoed through the halls, but the silence before it had already begun. The musicians reached the final movement of a graceful Alderaanian composition just as the lights dimmed for the second time. Unlike the earlier flicker, this interruption lingered for several long heartbeats before the chandeliers recovered their brilliance. Conversations faltered across the dining hall. Crystal goblets caught the trembling light, casting fractured reflections over polished walls and anxious faces. No one spoke immediately because every guest was waiting to see who would acknowledge the disturbance first. Vargos Deln refused to surrender control of the room. Rising smoothly from his chair, he lifted his glass with a reassuring smile that had settled many dangerous negotiations before. An unfortunate technical inconvenience, he declared. My engineers assure me the matter is already under control. I promise the only shock awaiting you tonight is the excellence of the final course. A few guests answered with polite laughter, but it sounded forced now. Deln noticed it, though he concealed the realization behind another practiced smile before taking his seat. The chief of security did not share his employer's confidence. A broad-shouldered Weequay veteran named Harl Sesk stepped quietly away from the wall and touched 2 fingers to his comm link. "Report," he ordered in a low voice. Static answered first, followed by a hurried reply. "Engineering teams are checking multiple relay failures. Internal sensors keep dropping offline for a few seconds at a time." Sesk frowned. "Sabotage?" The reply came after another burst of interference. "No evidence! Yet!" That single word settled heavily in his thoughts. Maul watched the exchange from across the chamber while pouring wine for a pair of syndicate accountants, too distracted to notice his silence. The security chief possessed discipline. He was neither arrogant nor careless, and unlike the wealthy guests, he understood that unexplained failures aboard a sealed vessel rarely occurred by chance. Maul respected such instincts. They made the hunt more satisfying. The Weequay would not die because he was foolish. He would die because he had been placed between the Sith and his prey. The third course began arriving, though not with the effortless precision of the earlier service. Delays in the kitchens rippled outward, forcing servants to improvise seating routes, while cooks shouted conflicting instructions behind swinging doors. Small mistakes accumulated. One guest received the wrong dish. Another waited several minutes for fresh wine. A decorative centerpiece toppled when an overworked attendant brushed the edge of the table. None of these mishaps mattered by themselves, yet together they eroded the illusion of perfect control that Delon had worked so carefully to create. Near the center of the table, a Black Sun envoy leaned toward one of the Pike representatives with narrowed eyes. "Your escorts have multiplied since we sat down," he observed. "Planning to renegotiate with blasters instead of contracts?" The Pike inclined his masked head ever so slightly. "We merely respond to changing circumstances. Surely your people have done the same." Neither raised his voice, but both glanced toward their bodyguards before returning to the meal. Around them, several other guests noticed the exchange and quietly adjusted their own expectations for the evening. Behind the dining hall, hidden beyond carved panels that concealed the service passages, Maul slipped into a narrow weapons locker reserved for the security staff. The electronic lock yielded to the force with a muted click. Inside, rows of blaster carbines rested upon magnetic racks beside stun batons, emergency armor, and sealed ammunition packs. Maul ignored the weapons. Blasters were noisy, ordinary instruments, useful for soldiers, but beneath the purpose of a Sith assassin. Instead, he studied the room itself, then extended one hand. The magnetic racks disengaged. Rifles slid silently from their mounts and settled gently upon the floor rather than crashing together. Ammunition packs drifted after them, stacking neatly in the corner beneath a heavy maintenance tarp. Stun batons followed one by one until every rack stood empty. Maul restored the magnetic locks, leaving the room outwardly undisturbed. The first guards to arrive would open the locker expecting instant access to their reserve weapons. Instead, they would waste precious moments searching while confusion spread beyond recovery. He departed without leaving a trace. At the same time, Harl Sesk reached the opposite end of the corridor with 2 trusted officers. "Double every patrol," he instructed. "Seal cargo access to unauthorized personnel, and I want reserve weapons distributed immediately." One officer nodded and hurried toward the locker, while the other continued toward engineering. Sesk lingered for a moment, studying the elegant walls surrounding him. They concealed too many blind corners, too many decorative alcoves, too many service passages that guests would never notice. The yacht suddenly felt much larger than it had at sunset. The officer assigned to the weapons locker arrived moments later. He entered confidently. A heartbeat passed, then another. "What in the stars?" he muttered before throwing open every storage compartment inside the room. The racks were empty. Reserve rifles had vanished. Ammunition was nowhere in sight. He searched beneath benches, inside supply crates, behind equipment cabinets, his breathing growing faster with every passing second. Finally, he seized his comlink. "Commander, we've got a problem. The reserve armory has been cleared out." Harl Sesk stopped walking. "What do you mean, cleared out?" "I mean exactly that," the officer answered, panic creeping into his voice. "Nothing's here." Sesk's expression hardened instantly. "Lock every access corridor. No one leaves this deck." The order echoed through the security network just as Maul emerged from another hidden passage overlooking the dining hall below. He heard magnetic blast doors beginning to close throughout the vessel, felt guards accelerating into defensive positions, and sensed alarm spreading beneath disciplined minds. Good. They had finally accepted that an enemy was already aboard. They simply remained blind to the most important truth of all. The enemy was standing above them, watching with patient satisfaction, and he had not yet drawn his lightsaber. The banquet still continued below, but every bite of food now carried the taste of uncertainty. The first move had belonged to Maul. The next would belong to those desperate enough to believe they could still stop him. The order to secure the banquet deck spread through the yacht within seconds, carried by encrypted comlinks and disciplined voices that struggled to remain calm. Heavy blast doors slid into place with deep mechanical groans, sealing off maintenance corridors, docking access points, and sections of the lower engineering decks. To the guests seated around the great dining table, the sounds blended easily with the ordinary rhythms of a large starship adjusting its internal systems. Few looked up. Those who did found only reassuring smiles from Dellen's attendants, who continued pouring wine as though nothing had changed. The illusion endured, but only just. Harl Sesk entered the dining chamber through a side passage with measured steps that concealed the urgency burning beneath his composure. He approached Vargos Dellen without drawing unnecessary attention, leaning close enough to speak quietly into the crime lord's ear. Dellen's smile did not disappear, though. It became noticeably tighter as he listened. "Missing weapons?" he repeated under his breath. "You're certain?" Sesk nodded once. "Someone is moving through the ship unseen. We don't know who, and we don't know how long they've been aboard." Dellen's fingers tightened around the stem of his crystal glass before he gently placed it upon the table. Across the room, Maul watched the exchange while carrying another tray toward a gathering of merchants discussing future shipping contracts. The Force revealed every subtle shift in emotion around him. Dellen's confidence had cracked, though not yet broken. Sesk's caution had hardened into genuine suspicion. The guests nearest them sensed that something serious had been whispered, and conversations began slowing as instinct urged experienced criminals to observe rather than speak. Fear spread more quickly than any virus because it required no explanation. One elderly merchant cleared his throat uneasily before addressing the servant beside him. "Has the entertainment been delayed?" he asked while adjusting the jeweled cuffs of his expensive robes. Maul inclined his head slightly, offering no answer. The merchant frowned at the silence before waving dismissively. "Never mind. Staff rarely know anything useful." He reached absent-mindedly toward the tray for another glass of wine, never realizing that the silent figure serving him had once stood beside Darth Sidious during the fall of Jedi Masters. Maul turned away without the slightest change in his measured pace. The first body was discovered minutes later. A junior communications technician had entered an isolated relay room near the central sensor array after receiving reports of intermittent signal failures. When another engineer arrived to assist him, the room stood open, its control panels dark and silent. The technician lay unconscious against the far wall, bound tightly with communication cables, stripped from the very equipment he had attempted to repair. He was alive, though barely aware of his surroundings. One sentence had been carved with precise cuts into the durasteel panel above his head. "He is not dead." The message reached Harl Sesk almost immediately. He stared at the report without speaking. "No identification?" he finally asked. The engineer shook his head. "Nothing. Whoever did it left no fingerprints, no weapon, no surveillance footage. Just that." Sesk read the words again. "He is not dead." The sentence meant nothing by itself, yet it carried a weight that settled coldly into his thoughts. It was not the work of a thief or saboteur, hoping to escape unnoticed. It was a declaration. Someone aboard the Gilded Crown wanted to be feared. Someone wanted the crew asking questions before the killing even began. Meanwhile, Vargos Dellon refused to interrupt the banquet. His advisors urged caution, suggesting that the guests be quietly escorted to their private suites until security regained control of the vessel. Dellon rejected the proposal immediately. "If we stop the dinner now," he said through clenched teeth, "every syndicate represented here will smell weakness. Rumors will spread before sunrise. I will not spend years building this reputation only to surrender it because of a frightened engineer and a missing weapons rack." He rose from his chair and addressed the room with practiced ease. "My friends, I regret a brief technical delay elsewhere aboard the yacht. Please continue enjoying your evening. Everything remains under control." Several guests applauded politely. Far fewer joined than before. At the western end of the hall, a Nikto captain quietly reached beneath his formal cloak and confirmed that his concealed blaster remained in place. A Pike bodyguard shifted closer to his employer. Across the table, one Black Sun envoy subtly nodded toward an associate who slipped away from the banquet without attracting attention. Every faction had begun making preparations independent of Dellon's assurances. Trust in the host was fading with every passing minute. Maul retreated once more into the hidden passages running behind the walls of the dining chamber. He moved through darkness, illuminated only by thin strips of maintenance lighting that painted the metal corridors in muted crimson. The elegant music drifting from the banquet sounded strangely distant now, muffled by layers of reinforced bulkheads and decorative stone. He paused beside a narrow observation slit overlooking the Hall of Triumph, where his broken lightsaber hilt still rested inside its display case beneath crimson light. For several long moments, he simply watched it. The damaged metal reflected memories more vividly than any hollow recording ever could. Qui-Gon's final breath, Obi-Wan's impossible leap, the burning pain of separation, endless darkness swallowing everything except hatred. His gloved hand rested lightly against the cold wall as the Force flowed around him like unseen fire. Soon he would reclaim what belonged to him. But first, the man who had dared to display it as a trophy would learn that some relics were never truly abandoned. Behind him, somewhere deep within the maintenance corridors, a security patrol rounded a distant corner. Boots struck metal decking in disciplined rhythm. Comlinks whispered quiet instructions. Harl Sesk had finally begun searching the hidden parts of the yacht. Maul smiled beneath the breathing mask. The hunt had changed. Until now, he had stalked his prey through a banquet filled with laughter and false confidence. Now another hunter believed he had entered the same game. The WK commander did not yet understand the difference between tracking a criminal and pursuing a Sith. One demanded skill, the other demanded luck beyond imagining, and luck had already deserted everyone aboard the Gilded Crown the moment Darth Maul crossed its threshold. The maintenance corridors behind the banquet hall were narrow enough that two armored guards could barely pass one another without turning sideways. Exposed conduits lined the ceiling, humming softly with power that pulsed through the heart of the yacht, while coolant pipes breathed cold air into the confined passages. Every sound carried farther than expected. The scrape of a boot, the click of a rifle sling, even the steady rhythm of breathing echoed through the steel labyrinth, making distance difficult to judge. Harl Sesk advanced through those corridors with 6 carefully chosen officers, each one experienced enough to know that silence often concealed the greatest danger. Sesk crouched beside a junction where one of his technicians had recovered a faint boot print in a layer of maintenance dust. It was fresh, though oddly incomplete, as if the weight pressing into the metal had not been entirely natural. One of the younger guards frowned as he studied it through a scanner. "The pressure pattern doesn't match standard military boots," he murmured, almost mechanical. Sesk remained motionless for a moment before rising again. Then whoever were hunting carries old injuries or specialized equipment. Stay alert. Wounded enemies are often the most dangerous. None of the officers argued, though every one of them tightened their grip upon their blasters. Several decks above, the banquet continued with strained determination. The musicians still played, but the music now served more as an attempt to fill uncomfortable silence than to entertain. Conversations had become quieter, each table speaking mostly among itself, rather than across the room. Deln noticed every hesitant glance toward the exits and every servant who moved a little too quickly between the guests. He forced another smile as fresh wine was poured into his glass, yet even he could taste the unease spreading through the hall more strongly than the expensive vintage before him. A Black Sun envoy leaned toward Deln and spoke without lowering his voice, enough to hide the challenge beneath his words. "You assured us this gathering would be secure." Deln folded his hands calmly upon the table. "And it is. My security chief is conducting precautionary inspections because of minor technical failures." The envoy's expression remained unreadable. "Minor failures? rarely require sealed corridors and armed patrols.
Dalen answered with measured confidence. If there were genuine danger aboard my vessel, you would not be hearing about it through rumors. Around them, several nearby guests pretended not to listen while missing none of the exchange. Deep within the service passages, Maul sensed the patrol drawing closer long before he heard their footsteps. The Force carried their presence through the walls as clearly as if he watched them directly. Disciplined minds, controlled breathing, no panic. Harl Sesk had wisely avoided sending frightened recruits into the search. Maul stepped into a maintenance alcove scarcely wider than his shoulders, allowing darkness to conceal him completely while the patrol approached the next intersection. The guards advanced with practiced coordination. Two covered the forward corridor while another watched the rear, their weapons sweeping steadily across every doorway and overhead access hatch. Sesk studied each junction before signaling the patrol onward, with restrained movements rather than spoken orders. He trusted experience more than noise. As they passed the alcove, one officer paused unexpectedly. His gaze drifted toward the shadows, where Maul stood perfectly still. An instinct whispered that something was wrong. He raised one hand slightly. "Commander." Before the warning could continue, every overhead light along the corridor failed. Darkness swallowed the passage in an instant. Only the faint red glow of emergency strips remained, painting the metal walls in the color of fresh blood. Several guards activated shoulder lamps immediately, their white beams cutting through the gloom in sharp columns. One light swept across the alcove just after Maul moved. The Sith flowed from the darkness without a sound, one gloved hand clamping over the nearest guard's mouth, while the other drove him backward into the wall with impossible force. The impact echoed once before the unconscious body slid silently to the floor. The remaining guards reacted with impressive speed. "Contact!" one shouted, raising his blaster toward a fleeting shadow, already disappearing around the next bend. Blue bolts tore through the corridor, striking pipes and bulkheads in showers of molten sparks. Steam erupted from a ruptured coolant line, flooding the passage with thick white vapor that reduced visibility to only a few meters. Sesk advanced through the cloud instead of retreating, his weapon steady despite the confusion. "Hold your fire," he barked. "You'll hit each other before you hit him." "You." Maul had already moved beyond their sight. He climbed an exposed maintenance ladder with astonishing speed, despite his crude mechanical legs, pulling himself into an overhead access shaft moments before blaster fire reached the junction below. Lying flat inside the narrow conduit, he listened as the guards searched beneath him. Their lights danced across the corridor while voices overlapped through static-filled comm links. One officer reported an injured comrade. Another requested medical assistance. A third insisted the attacker had vanished into solid walls. Maul closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a single measured breath. Confusion was becoming his strongest weapon. Back in the banquet hall, a distant series of muffled blaster shots interrupted the musicians. The melody faltered. Every conversation stopped. Guests turned toward one another as silence settled across the enormous chamber. Several instinctively rose from their seats, while bodyguards reached openly for concealed weapons. Dellen remained standing, though the confidence had drained from his expression for the first time that evening. He looked toward the guarded entrance, waiting for someone to explain the unmistakable sounds echoing through his own vessel.
No explanation came. Instead, one of the massive chandeliers suspended above the center of the hall flickered violently. Its light dimmed, recovered, then failed completely. A second chandelier followed. The warm golden glow that had filled the banquet since sunset gave way to uneven crimson emergency lighting that transformed polished marble into dark stone and cast every guest's face into sharp, unsettling shadow. Elegant surroundings suddenly resembled the interior of a warship preparing for battle. Fear no longer whispered through the gathering. It stood openly beside every chair. Hidden inside the ventilation shaft above the corridor, Maul listened as alarm sirens finally began to sound throughout the gilded crown. Only now, he thought. Only now do they understand. He reached beneath his cloak and slowly withdrew the weapon he had kept hidden since boarding the yacht. The damaged half of his old lightsaber remained imprisoned inside Dellen's display case, but Maul had built another after Naboo from stolen components gathered during years of survival. Its hilt lacked the flawless craftsmanship of his original weapon, scarred instead by desperate repairs and practical necessity. Yet when his thumb settled upon the activation switch, he felt the same familiar promise running through the cold metal. The time for servants and disguises had ended. The banquet was over. The alarm spread through the gilded crown in relentless waves, its steady pulse replacing the refined music that had filled the halls only moments before. Crimson emergency lights bathed every corridor in an unsettling glow, flattening rich colors into harsh shadows that stretched across polished floors like grasping hands. Servants abandoned trays where they stood, uncertain whether to flee or await orders that never came. Guests who had spent years navigating betrayals and assassinations now found themselves trapped aboard a luxurious prison drifting through empty space. Every instinct urged them to seize control before someone else did. Vargos Deln stepped onto the raised platform at the head of the dining hall and raised both hands for silence. "Remain calm," he commanded, his voice amplified across the chamber. "My security teams are containing the situation. Anyone drawing a weapon inside this hall will answer to me personally." Several guests hesitated, but not all obeyed. A pirate captain openly rested his blaster upon the table. Two pike guards shifted in front of their employer without attempting to hide the movement. Across the room, the Black Sun delegation exchanged brief nods, silently preparing for the possibility that negotiations had already failed. Harl Sesk's voice suddenly crackled through Dellen's private comlink. "Do not let anyone leave the banquet hall," the security chief said, breathing heavily after the pursuit. "We're dealing with one individual, highly trained, fast enough to disappear between visual confirmations. One officer is unconscious but alive." Dellen lowered his voice. "Who is it?" A long pause answered him before Sesk spoke again. "I don't know, but this wasn't random sabotage. Whoever boarded this yacht came here with a plan." Far above them, hidden within the maintenance shafts, Maul moved with deadly purpose. The ventilation network carried the warm scent of expensive food mixed with electrical smoke from overworked power relays. Through narrow inspection grills, he glimpsed fragments of the banquet below. Frightened faces, armed bodyguards, overturned chairs, and servants frozen between duty and survival.
His mechanical legs no longer scraped against the metal as they once had. Years of relentless adaptation had transformed crude survival into lethal efficiency. Pain remained, but it had become another servant of his hatred rather than its master. He reached a maintenance hatch overlooking the Hall of Triumph. The chamber below stood deserted. Its polished floor reflected only the crimson emergency lighting, while abandoned wine glasses remained scattered where startled attendants had fled at the sound of the alarms. At the center of the room, untouched amid the growing chaos, stood the transparent display case containing the broken half of his original lightsaber. 4 guards had been assigned to protect it earlier that evening. Now only 2 remained, both watching the surrounding entrances with increasing unease, while trying unsuccessfully to contact the rest of their unit through static-filled comm links. One guard swallowed hard before speaking. "Something's wrong with the network. I can't raise command." His partner kept his rifle aimed toward the nearest doorway. "Then we stay put. Dillon said this artifact never leaves the hall." The first guard glanced nervously at the display case. "You ever wonder why anyone would pay millions for half a broken weapon?" His companion answered without taking his eyes off the shadows. "After tonight, I'm starting to think we don't know what we bought." The hatch above them opened without a sound. Neither guard looked up. Maul dropped from the darkness with terrifying speed. His boots struck the polished floor almost silently, and before either man could turn, his rebuilt lightsaber ignited with a violent crimson snap hiss that filled the chamber like the roar of a living beast. The blade carved a brilliant scar through the darkness. One guard managed only a startled gasp before Maul's weapon swept once across his chest, sending him collapsing backward without another sound. The second fired a desperate blaster burst that flashed harmlessly into the ceiling as Maul spun beneath it, driving the hilt of the lightsaber into the man's helmet with crushing force. The guard crumpled unconscious beside the display platform. Silence reclaimed the hall. The crimson blade reflected across the transparent display case, bathing the relic inside in the same fierce glow it had known years before on Naboo. Maul stood motionless for several heartbeats, staring through the glass at the broken half of the weapon that had once completed the elegant staff crafted for him by Darth Sidious. His own scarred lightsaber hummed steadily in his hand, but it was not the one that had slain Qui-Gon Jinn or crossed blades with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Those memories rested behind the barrier before him, imprisoned as surely as he had once been. With a slow, deliberate motion, Maul extended his free hand. The Force answered. Hairline fractures raced across the transparent shielding. The reinforced case resisted for only a second before exploding outward in a shower of glittering fragments that scattered across the marble floor. The broken hilt rose gently into the air, turning once before settling into Maul's waiting palm. The metal was cold, scarred, incomplete, yet the instant his fingers closed around it, a flood of memories surged through him with startling clarity. Naboo's burning corridors, Sidious's approval, the triumph of victory, the agony of defeat. Everything lost. Everything waiting to be reclaimed. At that same moment, alarms intensified throughout the yacht. One of the surviving guards had managed to trigger a silent emergency beacon before losing consciousness. Harl Sesk received the signal instantly.
"The Hall of Triumph," he ordered into his comlink. "All units converge now. He's after the artifact." Maul lowered the recovered hilt beneath his cloak and extinguished his crimson blade. He heard dozens of boots already racing through distant corridors. He could have remained where he was and cut them down as they arrived. Instead, he chose something far more devastating. Turning away from the shattered display, he walked toward the great doors leading directly into the banquet hall itself. Behind those doors waited every crime lord, every syndicate envoy, every ambitious merchant who had laughed at his death and toasted his memory like an amusing legend. They had admired his weapon. Now they would finally meet its owner. His hand settled upon the bronze door handles. With one powerful motion, he pushed them open. The towering bronze doors swung inward with a deep, resonant groan that silenced every remaining conversation in the banquet hall. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance at once, expecting frightened guards, panicked servants, or perhaps Harl Sesk returning with an explanation that would restore order. Instead, a single figure emerged from the crimson-lit corridor beyond. His hood had fallen back, revealing a face marked in black and red, crowned with broken horns, its features carved by suffering rather than age. One hand rested at his side, holding an ignited crimson lightsaber whose glow reflected across the polished marble, while the other gripped the scarred half of the weapon displayed only minutes earlier as a trophy. No one spoke. For several endless heartbeats, disbelief held the room more firmly than fear. Vargos Deln stared as though reason itself had abandoned him. He looked from the shattered remnant of the display case, still clutched beneath Maul's arm, to the unmistakable markings upon the stranger's face. His lips parted, yet no words emerged. Finally, scarcely louder than a whisper, he managed, "Impossible." Maul's yellow eyes settled upon him with terrifying calm. "You celebrated my death," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying effortlessly through the silent chamber. "You purchased the remains of my life. Tonight I have come to collect payment." Several guests reacted before their minds fully accepted what stood before them. A pirate captain lunged for his blaster. Two Black Sun bodyguards drew compact carbines from beneath their formal cloaks. One pike guard shouted a warning in his own language while pushing his employer behind an overturned chair. The banquet dissolved into frantic motion. Crystal shattered beneath scrambling feet. Expensive dishes crashed across the floor, and servants fled toward every available exit. Deln remained frozen where he stood, unable to reconcile the legend he had mocked with the living nightmare now walking toward him. The first blaster bolt flashed across the hall. Maul's crimson blade moved almost lazily. The energy bolt ricocheted into a towering marble column, exploding it into a cloud of white stone dust that rained across nearby tables. Before the second shooter could fire, Maul crossed the distance between them with astonishing speed. His lightsaber described a single crimson arc through the air. The blaster clattered harmlessly onto the floor in two smoking pieces, followed an instant later by its stunned owner collapsing behind it. Panic erupted completely. Every disciplined negotiation, every carefully planned alliance, every polite smile vanished beneath the oldest instinct in the galaxy: survive. Harl Sesk burst through a side entrance with a squad of guards at his back.
The security chief halted for the briefest instant as recognition struck him. He had seen holo-recordings of the Sith warrior from Naboo years before, buried among old Republic security archives. They had all ended with the same conclusion: deceased. Yet the impossible stood before him in flesh and blood. Sesk recovered quickly, raising his rifle. "Take him alive if you can," he shouted, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were absurd. His guards opened fire in disciplined volleys that filled the hall with blue flashes and deafening thunder. Maul became a blur. His lightsaber spun in precise circles, redirecting bolts into chandeliers, pillars, and decorative fountains. One blast shattered a suspended crystal fixture, sending thousands of glittering fragments cascading onto the banquet tables below. Another struck a towering statue that toppled across the center of the hall, splitting the enormous dining table into jagged sections. Guests screamed as furniture overturned, and expensive feasts disappeared beneath clouds of dust and shattered stone. What had begun as the grandest banquet in the Outer Rim had become a battlefield in the span of seconds. Sesk advanced through the chaos. Instead of retreating, he fired measured shots rather than wild bursts, forcing Maul to keep moving while his officers spread outward in an attempt to surround the Sith. "Close the distance," he ordered. "Don't let him dictate the fight." Two guards obeyed, rushing forward with stun batons crackling in blue arcs. Maul met them without slowing. One baton never completed its swing before the Sith struck the wielder across the helmet with the hilt of his lightsaber, sending the man crashing unconscious into the remains of the banquet table. The second attacker found himself lifted bodily by an invisible force and hurled across the hall, smashing through a row of crystal display cabinets in an explosion of glass. Delon finally broke free of his paralysis. Surrounded by loyal bodyguards, he retreated toward the elevated platform at the head of the chamber where an emergency escape passage waited behind decorative panels. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he glanced repeatedly toward the crimson blade weaving through his security teams. This was no assassin hired by rivals, no mercenary, no ordinary killer. Every story whispered through the underworld about the Sith suddenly seemed pitifully incomplete. The creature advancing through his hall did not merely defeat armed men, he dismantled certainty itself. Maul saw him. Across the ruined banquet hall, beyond fleeing servants and desperate bodyguards, his gaze locked onto Vargos Deln. The crime lord noticed immediately. Their eyes met for only an instant, yet Deln felt as though the rest of the room had vanished, leaving only himself and the relentless figure walking through smoke and shattered marble. One of his bodyguards stepped into the Sith's path and fired twice. Maul deflected both bolts without looking away from Deln. The bodyguard hesitated for a fatal heartbeat before a powerful force shove hurled him backward into two companions, scattering them like leaves before a storm. Harl Sesk understood what was happening. "He wants Deln," the commander shouted. "Protect the boss." The remaining guards converged around the crime lord, forming a defensive ring while escorting him toward the concealed escape corridor. Their discipline returned under clear purpose. Blasters fired in coordinated succession, forcing Maul to slow for the first time since entering the hall. Smoke drifted through fractured beams of crimson light as alarms continued echoing throughout the yacht. Somewhere beyond the ruined chamber, terrified guests hid inside locked suites or searched desperately for escape pods. None of them knew whether they were fleeing a single attacker or the beginning of something far worse. Maul stopped in the center of the devastated banquet hall. Around him lay overturned tables, shattered crystal, abandoned feasts, unconscious guards, and trembling survivors pressed against distant walls. The celebration had ceased to exist. Only the hunt remained. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the recovered half of his old lightsaber for Dellen to see. The crime lord stared at the scarred metal with widening eyes as understanding finally settled upon him. This had never been about theft, never about sabotage. The banquet itself had been the bait, and every guest aboard the Gilded Crown had unknowingly attended a feast prepared for revenge. Without another word, Maul lowered the relic, ignited his blade once more with its familiar crimson roar, and stepped toward the fleeing crime lord. Dellen turned and ran. Vargos Dellen fled through the concealed passage behind the banquet dais, his polished shoes slipping across the smooth durasteel floor as the emergency lights painted the corridor in alternating bands of crimson and shadow. The elegant confidence that had carried him through years of negotiations had vanished completely, replaced by the raw instinct to survive. Behind him, his remaining bodyguards formed a desperate rear guard, firing disciplined bursts down the passage while urging their employer toward the emergency hangar. The narrow corridor amplified every blaster report into deafening thunder, and the smell of scorched metal mixed with the sharp scent of overheating circuitry. Somewhere deeper within the yacht, alarm klaxons continued their relentless cry, sounding less like a warning now than a funeral bell. Maul advanced without haste. Every bolt that reached him disappeared into the crimson whirl of his lightsaber or slammed harmlessly into the bulkheads after being deflected aside. His pace never changed. He had spent years surviving in darkness, driven onward by nothing except hatred and purpose. And no frightened bodyguards could slow what that suffering had forged. One guard rushed him with a vibroblade, shouting in defiance as he closed the final meters. Maul sidestepped with effortless precision, struck the man's wrist with the hilt of his weapon, and sent the blade spinning across the corridor before a force-driven blow hurled the attacker into the wall, hard enough to leave him unconscious. Harl Sesk emerged from a side junction with the last of his security officers, cutting across maintenance passages in a final attempt to intercept the Sith before he reached Dellen. The Weekay commander understood that retreat no longer mattered. If Dellen died, the syndicates gathered aboard the Gilded Crown would tear one another apart, fighting over the empire he left behind. Raising his rifle, Sesk called out in a steady voice, "Leave him. Your quarrel is with one man, not this ship." Maul stopped several paces away, studying the commander with unreadable eyes. "You have served him faithfully," he said. "Stand aside and you will leave this night alive." Sesk answered by tightening his grip on the blaster. "I swore an oath." The corridor erupted into violence. Sesk fired with remarkable discipline, forcing Maul to move rather than simply reflect every shot. The remaining guards joined him, their coordinated fire filling the confined passage with flashes of blue light. Maul flowed through the assault like a living shadow, his blade intercepting some bolts while others scorched the walls behind him. A heavy conduit burst overhead, releasing a shower of sparks that cascaded between both sides. The commander seized the opening, charging forward with a shock baton in his free hand. For a single heartbeat, the two warriors met at arm's length, baton crashing against lightsaber in a burst of brilliant energy. Sesk fought with courage worthy of a battlefield veteran. He feinted low, pivoted, and struck again, forcing Maul to give ground for the first time aboard the yacht. The Sith recognized genuine skill, but skill alone could not bridge the gulf between an exceptional soldier and one trained by Darth Sidious himself. Maul twisted inside the next swing, seized the commander's wrist, and drove him backward with overwhelming force-assisted strength. The shock baton flew from Sesk's hand as he struck the bulkhead. Before he could recover, Maul held the humming crimson blade at his throat. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Maul lowered the weapon. "Your loyalty deserves a better master," he said quietly, before striking Sesk across the temple with the pommel. The commander collapsed unconscious, rather than dead. Beyond the fallen security teams, Deln stumbled into the emergency hangar where his private shuttle waited with its engines already beginning to warm. Two terrified pilots hurried through pre-flight procedures while the crime lord shouted conflicting orders. "Seal the bay. Launch immediately. Forget the others." One pilot looked anxiously toward the still open blast doors. "Sir, the magnetic field won't disengage until the outer traffic lane clears." Deln slammed both hands against the cockpit frame. "Then clear it!" His voice cracked with desperation. For the first time in many years, wealth had failed him. A slow, deliberate clap echoed across the hangar. Deln turned. Maul stood framed within the entrance, smoke drifting around him from the ruined corridors beyond. His lightsaber cast crimson reflections across the polished hull of the waiting shuttle, while the recovered half of his original weapon remained secured beneath his cloak. The pilots froze where they stood, neither willing to flee nor brave enough to remain inside the cockpit. Deln swallowed hard and forced himself to speak. "I can pay you," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Credits? Ships? Information? Name your price." Maul continued walking. "You already paid it," he replied. "You chose the currency yourself when you celebrated my death." Deln backed toward the shuttle ramp until there was nowhere left to retreat. His breathing had become ragged, and every confident expression he had worn that evening had dissolved into naked fear. "I didn't know," he pleaded. "The relic was business, nothing more." Maul stopped only a few steps away. "You placed my past upon a table," he said, his voice colder than the vacuum beyond the hangar doors. "You invited the galaxy to laugh." Deln's eyes darted toward an emergency control panel. In one desperate motion, he reached for a concealed holdout blaster hidden beneath his formal robes. He never fired it. The crimson blade flashed once. The tiny weapon struck the floor in two smoking halves beside Deln's severed hand. He cried out and collapsed against the shuttle ramp, staring in horror at the impossible speed of the attack. Maul extinguished the lightsaber and stepped close enough that only Deln could hear his final words. "Remember this moment for the brief life you have left," he said. "Fear cannot be bought. It can only be earned." Then, with one swift and merciless stroke, the Sith ended the crime lord's life. Silence settled over the hangar, broken only by the distant wail of damaged systems struggling to keep the yacht alive. Hours later, emergency crews from nearby criminal escorts cautiously boarded the Gilded Crown. They found shattered banquet halls, burned corridors, terrified survivors, and dozens of unconscious guards who spoke of a horned warrior impossible to kill. Vargos Dellon was dead. His alliances had collapsed before a single agreement could be signed. The syndicates departed separately, each convinced that someone else had secretly unleashed the Sith upon the gathering. None dared claim Dellon's territories immediately, fearing the same fate might await them. Across the underworld, the story spread faster than any official report. A banquet had been prepared to celebrate the death of Darth Maul. Instead, every survivor left, carrying the same terrifying truth. Far from the crippled yacht, a small stolen shuttle slipped quietly into hyperspace. Inside the dim cockpit, Maul placed the recovered half of his original lightsaber upon the console before him. It was still broken, just as he remained scarred and incomplete. Yet it no longer belonged to collectors or cowards. Outside, the stars stretched into brilliant rivers of light as the shuttle vanished into the darkness between worlds. Somewhere ahead waited Obi-Wan Kenobi. Somewhere beyond him waited Darth Sidious. Tonight had not ended Maul's story. It had announced to the galaxy that the Sith warrior they believed buried beneath Naboo had returned, and that revenge, once placed upon the table, was always served cold. If you travel long enough through the history of the Star Wars galaxy, you begin to notice that victories and defeats are rarely as permanent as they first appear. Republics rise, empires fall, Jedi triumph, Sith return, and every generation believes it has buried the shadows of the last. Yet the Force is not a tale of simple endings. It remembers every choice, every wound, and every promise left unfinished. Darth Maul survived not because hatred is stronger than death in every case, but because he surrendered himself completely to that hatred until it became the only thing keeping him alive. In that way, his revenge was not the beginning of his freedom, but another link in the chain he willingly carried. You have seen that the greatest mistake aboard the Gilded Crown was not greed alone, nor pride, nor even cruelty. It was the belief that fear could be displayed safely once its source was believed dead. The crime lords admired power as an ornament, something to purchase, exhibit, and toast over fine meals without understanding the living cost behind it. That blindness belongs to many corners of the galaxy. Those who treat history as a trophy often forget that history is made by people whose stories are not yet finished. In the Star Wars saga, forgotten enemies have a way of returning when certainty grows too comfortable. There is another truth hidden beneath the violence. Maul moved with remarkable discipline, patience, and skill, qualities that in another life might have served justice or protected the innocent. Instead, every gift he possessed had been forged into a weapon by the teachings of the Sith. That is the quiet tragedy running beneath his triumph. The dark side grants focus, endurance, and terrible strength, but it demands that every victory feed the hunger for another. Revenge satisfies for only a moment before the emptiness returns, pointing toward the next enemy, the next debt, the next wound that can never truly heal. This is why the story belongs naturally within the larger tapestry George Lucas created. The Star Wars galaxy has always been filled with individuals who stand at the meeting place between destiny and choice. Some, like the Jedi, struggle to master themselves before mastering the world around them. Others, like the Sith, seek first to command the world, believing that mastery of themselves can wait until later. Again and again, the galaxy reveals the same lesson. Power without restraint consumes its bearer long before it conquers everyone else. Even those who seem unstoppable remain prisoners of the path they have chosen. As you leave this tale, remember that the banquet was never only about a crime lord or a stolen relic. It was about the moment when forgotten darkness stepped quietly back into a galaxy that believed it had already turned the page. Somewhere beyond the stars, countless beings still laugh, bargain, hope, and dream without knowing what waits beyond the next hyperspace lane. Somewhere, a lone shuttle disappears into the endless night, carrying a warrior whose vengeance has only begun. And far away beyond crowded worlds and familiar trade routes, an abandoned mining station continues to drift through silent fields of broken stone, as cold and empty as the place where the galaxy first believed Darth Maul had been left behind forever.